It falls on me to introduce Grant King. Grant King, who I need say no more than he is the CEO of one of Australia's most successful energy companies. As he sits here, Origin is actually generating energy and electricity which is being used by people in Australia. And he's someone who, to my mind, is very clear and very articulate on the really serious questions and serious policy questions that need to be addressed if we're going to reduce the emissions that currently are part of our energy system. He also, I think, is very articulate about the relationship between energy efficiency, which is a good thing to do, versus actually taking the hard decisions to decarbonise or at least reduce the carbon intensity of our energy system. And we're really honoured to have him here with us today to give the first presentation. Grant King.
Obviously, the theme this evening of the Deacon's Lectures is the climate change challenge. And to the extent that we believe CO2 emissions are the driver of human-induced climate change, then the way we produce and consume energy is central to our attempts to reduce CO2 emissions. In Australia, the stationary energy sector emits 290 million tonnes of CO2 every year, or 50% of Australia's CO2 emissions. The company I'm fortunate enough to lead is Origin Energy. We supply over 20% of the energy used by Australia's households, businesses and industry as both a full fuel producer and primarily gas as a fuel, an electricity generator and a retailer. We have in recent years built several thousand, in the process of building several thousand megawatts of new gas-fired generation, Australia's largest, most efficient gas-fired combined cycle power station in Queensland. We're currently building one of the largest, if not the largest, open cycle power station here in Western Victoria at a town called Mortlake. We've invested probably $150 million in geothermal energy in Central Australia, trying to find out whether that resource is accessible. Probably now spent over $100 million on photovoltaic research. We have contracted for large amounts of wind and have built wind farms in New South Wales. And we've been an active promoter of green energy, with about a third of our customers making a choice to pay more to buy what we would call a green energy product in its various forms. So we feel quite familiar with many of the issues that we need to see addressed in order to reduce the carbon intensity of our energy systems. It is generally uncontested to suggest that one of the preconditions for a growing, prosperous economy is a competitively priced and reliable supply of energy. We are fundamentally interested in ensuring that the Australian community can continue to enjoy this benefit, although clearly on an increasingly less carbon-intensive basis. And our approach to this debate is a practical approach. We're a practitioner in this business, and we make many billions of dollars of investment decisions involved in this industry and in the energy supply chain. So for us, these are very real and near issues. Our governments have set for us, and this at least currently remains still an area of bipartisan political support, that we reduce our national carbon emissions by 5% from 2000 levels by 2020. Using Treasury business as usual forecasts, this would require a reduction in carbon emissions of 140 million tonnes. And much of my presentation today is addressing the timeframe and that target through to 2020. Clearly there's a longer term timeframe that we could talk about. The stationary generation sector, in which we participate, sector's share of this task is 60 million tonnes of carbon emissions, and we presume that we would probably, that is, we in the energy sector presume that we would probably need to achieve more than our sector's share of this target, given the challenges we believe other sectors will face in meeting their share. So, for example, the agricultural sector may well be challenged in meeting its share of that target by 2020. Our interest in the climate change challenge, as I said, therefore, a practical one, and resolves almost entirely around the question, what fuel does society want us to use? The answer to this question is in turn driven by quite a complex interplay of economic, technical and public policy issues. My objective in this speech is to offer a view on some of these issues and the extent to which public policy is moving us towards or away from the emissions reductions targets that have been set. Now, to do that, some description of the stationary energy sector just to sort of scope out the challenge. Installed generation capacity in Australia is approximately 50,000 megawatts, generating approximately 230,000 gigawatt hours of electricity each year. The average emissions intensity is about 1 tonne of carbon per megawatt of electricity generated. The primary fuels that we currently use for this generation is 24% from brown coal, clearly here in Victoria. Black coal, primarily New South Wales and Queensland, 57%, natural gas 30%, and renewables, which is mainly what we all think of as old hydro, the Snowy scheme, largely 6%. So 6% from renewables, largely the Snowy. The carbon intensity of our older brown coal-fired power stations is around 1.4 tonnes of CO2 equivalent per megawatt hour, black coal 0.9 tonnes, natural gas combined cycle power stations about 0.4 tonnes of CO2 equivalent, so much less than a third of the older brown coal stations here in Victoria. Our oldest large brown, that is the country's oldest of the large brown coal-fuelled power stations, Hazelwood, emits approximately 16 million tonnes of CO2 per annum, and that is approximately 3% of Australia's current CO2 emissions. So you can see that quite a bit of the debate in our sector does evolve around the future of these large brown coal-fired power stations. Given these figures, it should therefore be no surprise why we see the performance of this sector as central to the climate change challenge. The next point to make in respect of our industry is that while 2020 is 2 or 3 electoral cycles away, and was even further so when these targets were set, they are for our industry just a moment away, just a moment in time. And the reason for this is the time it takes our industry to permit and develop both generation, transmission and distribution assets. Now, our industry has an enormous capacity to build assets. It's always interesting when one delves into a little bit of history, the sort of figures that come up. In the 40 years to 2005, so 65 to 2005, the Australian population grew 80%. But the demand for electricity over that time grew 650%. Our industry delivered that increase in capacity, delivered on that enormous growth. I find as a corollary to this discussion that, of course, there's another debate going on in the Australian community about population growth and our country's ability to see our population grow some 60% to 35 million people by 2050. And, of course, the two important years that people often talk about in the climate change discussion is 2020 for near or medium-term targets and 2050 for much deeper cuts. Clearly there's also a debate evolving around our capacity to, for our population, not our capacity, but if we have that population growth, our capacity to meet that growth. Certainly the energy industry can do that given sufficient lead times, but it does take a long time to build and deploy assets in our business. I don't plan to talk to this issue, and I know other speakers will during the course of this series, but it is important when you reflect over that prior 40 years that 650% growth reflected a period of time when Australia went not just through a period of great industrialisation, but substantial increase in wealth. And again, unquestionably increased energy consumption is correlated with growth in GDP and growth in wealth and personal income. And that is a growth trajectory that much of the developing world has yet to go through. And I'm sure other speakers will address that during the course of this lecture series. So if we shorten the time frame to 2020, much of my comments are about between now and 2020. The national electricity market's projected growth in demand for electricity is approximately 1.5% a year for energy and 2.5% for capacity, or about 1,200 megawatts per year of new capacity needing to be built between now and 2020. The distinction between energy and capacity is how much we use through the year. Every time we turn our light switches on, how does that add up? What's all your bills add up to, for example, in terms of energy consumption? But of course, as an industry, we have to deploy sufficient capacity to meet that energy requirement on generally the hottest day of the year, or generally actually the third hottest day of the year, periods when we have sustained heat waves. And we're an industry which deploys capital to meet a demand which generally arises less than 1% of the time. So that's why capacity is a different concept from energy in our industry, and we have to build the capacity to meet the market's requirements for energy under the period of greatest demand. And I can tell you from many years of experience, society has a very low tolerance for that energy not being there when it needs it. Now, the two big levers available for us to pull in Australia to reduce the CO2 intensity of power generation is firstly what happens to the existing fleet of installed generation, the 50,000 megawatts or thereabout that's installed, and what fuels and technologies do we use for the new capacity required to meet growing demand for energy. To understand the potential of these levers, it's worth a quick examination of the fuel and technology choices available to us. From a fuel perspective, Australia is truly blessed, with one exception. At current consumption, we have black coal reserves of over 100 years, brown coal reserves over 500 years. Australia has vast natural gas reserves in both the North West Shelf province largely, and of course the emergence of the coal seam gas industry in Queensland and New South Wales, which have established at current production rates over 100 years of natural gas reserves. And more broadly, we've seen internationally the rise of what's called unconventional gas, particularly in the US, and the recognition of the vast resources that are potentially available in as little as the last 2 years. Southern Australia, South Australia, Victoria, southern New South Wales has large wind resources with world-class wind speeds greater than 8 metres per second, exceeding probably 15,000 megawatts. So we have very substantial and very competitive wind resources. We may have unconventional, and I stress unconventional, geothermal resources which could exceed 10,000 megawatts. And all these numbers need to be put in perspective of a current requirement of 50,000 megawatts, and effectively an unlimited solar resource. We also, of course, have some of the world's largest resources of uranium, for those that are interested in nuclear power. And of course, the one resource that we lack is water. And it's generally considered that Australia's hydroelectric potential is generally fully exploited. Clearly, some countries have substantial hydro potential, which of course is a renewable form of energy. So while Australia's fuel resources are large and indigenous, that is, they're here in Australia, we draw our technology for power generation from overseas. Australia is not a country that generally invents or generally regarded to invent technology for power generation, so we draw that technology from overseas. In respect of our technology choices, the important point to make in respect to targets for 2020 is that we can really only choose to deploy currently available proven technologies, primarily because of the time it takes to develop, permit and build projects. So again, to have a quick run through, as we look at the available technologies, we can make the following observations. Coal and gas technologies are mature technologies, widely accessible, and whilst there are still gains in efficiency to be made in those technologies, they're probably single-digit % gains as distinct to step changes in the efficiency of those current forms of technology. To permit and build a new greenfield coal-fired power station historically has taken 5 to 7 years. Now I'd suspect it would take longer because I think it would be considered far more environmentally contentious to do so. A new combined cycle gas turbine, so for base load power from gas, a combined cycle gas turbine would take 4 to 5 years at best to permit and build. The Darling Downs power station, from our initial permitting to completion, will take probably 6 or 7 years. So it gives you an idea of the lead times taken to conceive, site, develop, permit and then ultimately build these large baseload energy projects. A nuclear power station in countries where nuclear power is already used, in other words, society has chosen to use nuclear power in Europe, in some countries in Europe, not all of Europe, some countries in Europe and the US, it would probably take at least 10 years to permit and build a nuclear power station. And the latest generation of reactors, of which are projects have been built in France and Finland, it's quite possible that that cycle will take much longer than 10 years from the initial project conception through to completion, with the latest round of nuclear plants incurring substantial delays both in terms of construction and increases in cost. So nuclear in particular in a country where it's already accepted is a substantial challenge. We do not believe that nuclear power fits in for those reasons to the solution, certainly by 2020 and probably not even by 2030. Wind is a mature technology, and again by mature we mean turbine technology, blade technology, still probably got some scale advantages to come, but again probably not step change. The size of units deployed will probably continue to grow, and we're seeing larger and larger units, that is in terms of capacity per tower, offshore increase, onshore typically in the sort of 2 to 4 megawatt range per tower. At the moment, again, historically it's taken 3 to 4 years to permit and build wind projects, but I can assure you for those of us involved in doing so, they are becoming increasingly contentious for the community, because the scale of projects needing to be deployed to meet the renewable energy targets, which I'll talk more about in a little while, is requiring larger and larger projects to be developed. And I'm quite sure that during the permitting process of these projects, for any given size of project one seeks to permit, a certain amount of that capacity or size will be lost to the permitting process. So it is a big challenge for us to rapidly deploy wind, but again, the technology is available and mature. Unconventional geothermal energy is still in the R&D phase in Australia, and by unconventional, if you have a simple picture of what conventional geothermal is like, the geologist would simply say, think about a failed volcano, and unconventional geothermal energy tends to work in failed volcanoes. So the hot rock is sitting there just under the ground, water is exposed to that rock in sedimentary reservoirs, and that water is accessed and produced, ultimately turned into steam and used to drive steam turbines. In Australia, we do not have that opportunity, but we do have vast amount of thermal energy locked up in rocks, particularly in the Cooper Basin. But to access that resource is a very different challenge and requires not so much brand new technology, but the adaptation of existing technologies, largely from the petroleum industry, to work at extremes of pressure and depth and temperature that it's not typically been designed to do. So we have great hopes for what geothermal energy can do, but it is important to stress that it's still in the R&D phase. Many elements, and this is all of course spoken from the point of view of a company having to make these choices to ensure we continue to have a reliable supply of energy. Many elements of CCS, or carbon capture and sequestration technology, exist, but there is little evidence that they can be deployed on a commercial basis before 2020, if at all. There was momentum behind a number of demonstration projects. Quite a number of these projects, particularly overseas, have not made it through to fruition and have a long way to go before they demonstrate that they can compete effectively against current proven thermal technologies and even against some of the more widely accessible renewable technologies. All of the currently available renewable choices in Australia capable of being deployed on a large scale are, in our view, 2 to 3 times magnitude of cost greater than our current thermal generation choices and are uneconomic without substantial subsidies. And again, we'll come back and talk about the RET scheme in a minute, because that is one way those technologies are effectively subsidised and brought forward. In our view, given the time taken to deploy, decisions on the projects that would meet our requirements for reliable and competitive supply of baseload energy will need to be made within the next 3 to 5 years, given the lead times it takes, as I say, to build and deploy. Clearly, for that reason, our choices will generally be constrained to currently available technologies and the fuels they use. So much of the technology debate is not going to contribute to the achievement of targets by 2020. They are clearly looking at longer-term contribution, perhaps to targets towards 2050. And returning then to the levers of new build generation and the existing generation fleet, it's important to remember that until late last year, when the political consensus around the implementation of the ETS dissolved, the 2 main public policy instruments to influence fuel and technology choices for power generation were the RET scheme, the Renewable Energy Target, the Mandatory Renewable Energy Target, and of course, broadly, an ETS, specifically the ETS that became known as the CPRS, the Carbon Pollution Reduction Scheme. And those were the 2 primary policy levers that were going to be used towards taking us to a lower carbon intensity future. If we consider first the level of new investment in generation, then the influence of the RET scheme is very important. So this is that amount of the 2 levers, the amount of new build generation that has to occur to meet our requirements for 2020. It transpires that the renewable energy target of approximately 20% of energy by 2020 from renewable sources, if it was to be met by the only current renewable energy technology able to be deployed on a large scale in Australia, which is wind, would require 7,000 to 9,000 megawatts of capacity to be installed. This is approximately equal to the projected growth in generation capacity required to meet our needs at 2020. I'm never quite sure whether governments have actually understood that and sized the figure accordingly, but I suspect it's coincidental. But nonetheless, that is the facts, that if you use wind, you need about as much generation capacity installed to supply that target as the growth of capacity to meet our energy requirements for 2020. However, wind is an intermittent fuel, and you might recall earlier I talked about energy through a year and peak capacity. Wind is an intermittent fuel, and this intermittency has consequences for our energy supply chain. Because of intermittency, the national electricity market, so the market operator, ascribes a reliability factor of less than 10% to wind. And if I can distinguish between reliability factor and capacity factor, when you have these, what I would call world-class wind speeds, a good site for a wind farm would generally have a capacity factor of about 40% plus. In other words, about 40% of the time you would get an effective output from that wind farm. But of course, the wind is unpredictable, and the reliability of factor being less than 10% talks to how much you could rely on that wind being there when you actually needed it. And that gets back to the details of meteorology and climate. And the fact of the matter is that the wind tends not to blow when we have these heat spells, particularly the ones that wash across South Australia and Victoria in the late part of the calendar year, in the summer months and the early part of the calendar year. And this was an event that occurred in about November last year, when we had very hot weather roll across South Australia and Victoria, and wind contributed, of all of the installed wind capacity, wind contributed a very small amount to our capacity requirement at that time. We believe that between now and 2020, to meet RET requirements through wind will require, as I say, about 7,000 megawatts of wind to be built. But with a 10% reliability factor, we would ascribe only about 700 megawatts of firm capacity against that target by 2020. So wind needs to be backed up by a reliable fuel source, and this is almost certain to be open-cycle gas-fired generation, the sorts of projects that we're building, for example, in Mortlake in Western Victoria, which is about a 650 megawatts or so open-cycle gas turbine power station. So in fact, it turns out that to meet that 7,000 megawatts of new demand, we need to install about 13,000 megawatts of capacity to do that because of that intermittency of wind. And clearly that introduces an additional cost to the system not factored into the actual cost of wind generation. In addition, our transmission systems particularly are ultimately constrained as to the amount of intermittent generation they can accept. As a rule of thumb, perhaps 20% of energy can come from intermittent sources like wind before you have to make substantial changes to the transmission system, and I believe in South Australia there's already in excess of that amount on the system in South Australia. Gas transmission systems and storage systems will also need to be augmented to provide increased gas supply for peaking generation to firm that intermittent wind capacity up. We would estimate that in Victoria as much as 500 terajoules a day, that's a very exotic number, but about 500 terajoules a day of extra capacity would need to be built in our gas transmission and storage systems to have the gas there to run the peaking power plants when they're needed. But they will probably only need to run less than 5% of the time. So a lot of investment has to be recovered across a very small number of running hours. Large amounts of intermittent must-run generation will result in periods of negative pricing. We have already seen, and this might sound like a strange phenomenon because as consumers you've never seen this on your power bill, but we've already seen prices as low as minus $100, that is minus $100 per megawatt hour in South Australia overnight. Because of course overnight demand is low, generation is still being dispatched, the wind is blowing, wind is what we call must run because it has a zero marginal cost, so it will always run, and coal-fired power stations will actually pay to stay on the system because they can't shut these stations down. They're not designed to be operated on an on and off basis. Now that in itself you could say is a good outcome because the lower carbon intensity fuels are meeting our power requirements, but of course what it means is once we lock in the nature of those aspects into the nature of our electricity supply systems, they'll be locked in for a generation, they'll be locked in for that life cycle of assets. And it will make it very difficult to build other forms of baseload assets if we get this effect in our system. And for those of you, for example, who have a preference for nuclear power, in our view it will make it very difficult to fit nuclear power into the system because we will see basically nuclear power stations need the same price 24 hours a day. They're not designed to be turned on or turned off, they're designed to run all the time and receive the average price all the time, but that's not the way our markets work, and it's not the way they will work as we bring more and more renewable generation into the system.